Okay, guys, I am back with another creepypasta. Like I said, this belongs to Creepypasta, one of my favorite creepypasta YouTubers. And last time I did one of them by him, he got a lot of views, a lot of likes, so thank you guys, and please enjoy. This is called Creepypasta Fog. Enjoy.
If you are reading this, then I am dead, and you are standing aboard a derelict Cyclone-class patrol ship, the USS Mistral, with her engines dead and her electrical systems non-functional. I was, the XO of this vessel, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Simmons. Please read this carefully. If you are an officer or enlisted man in the United States Navy, this is an order. Scuttle this vessel immediately. Do not finish this letter. Get off the Mistral at once and send her down. Consider this a quarantine scenario. All hands are likely dead. God help you if they are not. We are 8 days out of Kirkwall, tracking an intermittent and scrambled distress call from what appeared to be an Icelandic fishing vessel, the Magnus Dottir, deep in the no-fishing zone of the North Sea. We found the vessel, or rather, we found a mile-wide streak of oil and fragments, the largest of them still burning. The night before, the enlisted man on watch had reported seeing a flash of light on the horizon. The Magnus Dottir's crew were nowhere to be found, except for one lone fisherman, unburned and floating in the far end of the debris field. He had been shot in the forehead with a small caliber revolver. When we fished his pale blue corpse from the rigid water, he was still clutching a fishing knife in one clamped hand. What we were able to piece together from the fragmented and confounding evidence was that for reasons unknown, the crew had been in conflict, resulting in the murder of at least one sailor and the eventual sabotage and destruction of the ship. Visibility was only a few hundred feet as we spent the next day drifting silently among the debris, in hopes of finding a survivor. The crew was already visibly shaken by the discovery, the grim dread of the fog, the lone smouldering pieces of the Magnus Dottir that collided with our hull unsettled even the most seasoned of us. We had expected a nice easy cruise, and the simple retrieval of a dozen thankful Icelandic fishermen. What we got, at first, was a silent and oil-slick-coated sea, a single corpse, and more than a few nagging questions. The Mistral had just been serviced, after an extended tour with the Atlantic Fleet in Bahrain before her transfer to the North Sea. She was in good running order, so I can only assume that the initial mechanical failure was an act of sabotage or of some external force. It happened the first night, when our final sweep had been completed, and we returned to the site of the Magnus Dottir's first transmission. There was nothing initially remarkable about the spot, a cold and lonely set of coordinates, and little else. I was in my cabin, just settling down, when the call sounded from the captain, offering little information, just a stern order to meet him on deck. Dressing quickly, I emerged from my cabin into a cloud of palpable unease and fear. The enlisted men and the junior officers were coursing through the ship towards the deck, like panicked rats. No one made eye contact or spoke. There was none of the usual gallows humor or camaraderie that bubbles up in situations of limited information. Just a grim inertia that pulled us out into the Arctic night. On deck, the night was unnaturally clear and cold, and the bright of the stars burned in the frosty air. Around us, in every direction, just a few hundred yards away, the fog and clouds hauled, as if held at bay by our presence. The captain was at the railing, leaning over with the men on watch. I approached him, suddenly desperate and panicking to know what was happening. When I saw it, the light flooding up from beneath us. The sea was flat, like the surface of a mirror. The water was black, reflecting the pale pinpricks of the stars. But beneath the surface, something glowed with a cold light, pulsating shapes of violet, green, and deep cobalt blue shone from beneath. They flowed and merged and shimmered silently, deep below the glassy sea. We stared. 24 men and women, struck dumb and horrified by the sight. There was a sense of scale that emerged from the fluid movement of the lights. They seemed to be many fathoms beneath us, which would make them terribly large and impossibly fast. There were no solid shapes, and no disturbance of the water, just a deep field of liquid, flowing light. We watched for what seemed like hours, entranced by the mesmerizing ballet of cold light, a mirror reflection of the northern lights. When it ended, abruptly, there were 3 almost simultaneous events. First, the lights seemed to contract, each mote freezing in place and collapsing like the iris of an eye in bright sunlight. Secondly, there was a tremor in the air that first raised the hair on the back of my neck. As the ghostly lights winked out of existence, it rose in intensity until I thought my eyeballs might shake their way out of my head. Through the fog and sudden pain, I heard a noise rising above the Arctic wind, a humming vibration from the Mistral herself that matched the electric shuddering in my skull. It was as if every light board aboard the Mistral was suddenly flushed with power, flaring bright and buzzing noisily in their housings. And when the wine had reached a fever pitch, they began to pop and shatter among a shatter of sparks. From start to finish, it lasted less than 2 seconds, and we were left floating silently in the dark waters beneath the starry sky on a dead and crippled boat. The damage was invisible, without any obvious cause and total. Nothing aboard the Mistral worked. Each carefully crafted system of multiple redundancies had crumbled. Every light was shattered, and even the replacement bulbs and the small flashlights we all carried held fused and useless filaments. Satellite phones, shortwave radios, all means of communication were useless bricks of plastic and wire. Every battery was dead. Every stereo system was silent. We were adrift, without sail or engine, isolated from the world by 100 miles of black and silent sea. The crew moved through the ship the first night like moles, fumbling through dark corridors with only a few pale green chemical lights to check each system. They relayed each disheartening message like a fire brigade through the darkness to where the captain and I stood on the deck, trying to make sense of the senseless. At last, when nothing else could be done, I fumbled my way back to my cabin and tried to sleep, the darkness feeling like an impressive, many-fingered hand slowly gripping my chest. The next morning, I again took stock of our situation, hoping for some fragment of hope we had passed by in the night. The damage was total. We would have to find a way to send a distress call, and hope that we had not drifted too far from our last known coordinates. The men may not have known the full details, but it was clear from their haunted visages that they knew how dire the situation was. The first death was that afternoon. The sound of screaming brought me above deck and into a thick, heavy fog. High in the gloom, I could see bright, burning specks of light descending slowly. My stomach turned. It was 2 signal flares drifting uselessly through the haze. Some damn fool had fired the signal flares. I burned with an unfamiliar and foreign rage and rushed through the fog to the foredeck with hatred in my blood and my fists clamped tight. The scene that emerged from the fog broke me from my stupor. The enlisted man, a flare gun still in his hand, lay broken in a pool of blood. The captain stood over him, clutching the railing, driving the heel of his boot repeatedly into the broken mess of the boy's skull. I realized then that the screaming I heard, the high, keening wail, was coming from the captain, his face in a rictus of animal rage. Around them was a small crowd, standing motionless and silent, watching like sentinels. The captain turned to see me and dropped into a crouch, his fingers wrapped around the flare gun, and he raised it level with my eyes. We stared for a moment at each other, our eyes locked as he panted heavily, his face lightly splattered with blood. The only sound was the wet gurgling exhaling from the enlisted man's death rattle, a bubble of blood forming on his ruined face. I'd served with this man for nearly a decade. This was not the man I knew. This was a hollow simulacrum filled with violence and terror. I spoke to him then, in a soothing tone. I asked him to hand me the flare gun. He said nothing at first, and then spoke, his voice a tiny, trembling sound that was swallowed up by the thick gloom around us. "He's murdering us, Ryan. The fog, the flares will never..." He shook his head and clenched his eyes tight, as if he were trying to shake himself from a dream. Then he shuddered once, violently, his back arching like a seizure. "This little asshole has killed us," he choked out. The flare gun wavered in the air, and I took a step closer, reaching out for him. He opened his eyes, and I froze again, as we stared silently at one another. "You're going to die here," he giggled quietly. "I always wanted to watch you die, you coward." He tilted his head back and laughed, one hyena-like bark to the grey sky, and then put the flare gun in his mouth and fired. The last flare, igniting and temporarily bathing his head in a halo of magnesium orange and smoke. He tumbled back over the railing. If there was a splash when he hit the water, it was swallowed by the fog. I stood for what seemed like a very long time. It slowed. Guys, this was the Fog Creepypasta Part 2 will be coming out in a minute. But guys, just enjoy this one. And I'll see you guys in Part 2. And by the way, this might be my last episode before school. So yeah, guys, see ya. Part 2.